the house was never truly quiet. Even at 1:30 in the morning, when the last lamp had been turned down and the last voice had gone still, the burrow breathed. It creaked in its own particular rhythm, a settling in the west wall, a shudder in the staircase that had been shuddering since before Ron was born, the low, persistent groaning of the pipes that ran upward through the heart of the house like old veins. Ron had grown up with all of it. He knew which floorboard on the second landing would announce him, which step on the attic stairs would hold his weight if he pressed to the left edge rather than the center, which door, if opened slowly enough, would not catch on its swollen frame. He had learned these things the way children learn the rules of a house they love, not by being taught, but by needing to move through it without being heard. Tonight, he needed that knowledge more than usual. He paused at the top of the attic stairs, one hand on the low beam, and waited. Below him, the house breathed on. He heard nothing that suggested anyone else was awake. Not the soft creak of his mother's chair, not the rustling that meant Fred or George had stayed up past sense, not the particular quality of silence that filled a room where someone was pretending to sleep. Just the house, doing what the house did, indifferent to the fact that Ronald Bilious Weasley was standing in the dark at 1:30 with too much in his head to lie down. He pushed open the attic door and stepped through. The smell hit him first, dust and something older beneath it, the particular musty warmth of a room that had never quite decided what it was for. Old trunks sat against the far wall, their brass fittings gone green, their contents undisturbed for years. Broken furniture gathered in one corner, a chair with a missing leg, a mirror whose silver had gone patchy and dim, a set of shelves that had been moved up here when the kitchen was reorganized and never moved back, boxes with faded labels in his mother's handwriting, a rolled-up carpet that might once have flown, though no one had tested it in decades, and in the far corner, in the makeshift bed behind the water tank, the ghoul. It was asleep, which was its default state at this hour. It lay tangled in a sheet that had seen better years, its breathing labored, its skin a greyish colour that the moonlight, filtering through the small, dirty window, did not improve. It looked, Ron thought, not for the first time, profoundly miserable, even at rest, which was appropriate, he supposed, given what it would be asked to do very soon. He crossed the attic without making noise and sat down on one of the old trunks, close enough to see the ghoul clearly, far enough to feel that he was not intruding on something he didn't understand. For a long moment, he simply looked at it. The plan had seemed sensible when Bill first laid it out, logical, even clever in a grim sort of way. The ghoul would be modified. It would appear to anyone who came looking to be Ron Weasley laid low with spattergroit, a disease unpleasant and contagious enough to discourage visitors, and convincing enough from a distance to keep suspicion from settling on the family. His mother had cried when Bill explained it. His father had sat very still and stared at the table. Fred and George had exchanged a look that, for once, held no humour at all. Ron had nodded. He had said, "Yes, fine, that makes sense." He had meant it. He still meant it. That wasn't the problem. The problem was harder to name than that. He had been trying to name it for 3 weeks, lying awake in his old room while the summer heat pressed down and Harry slept quietly in the other bed, and he hadn't managed it yet. It wasn't cowardice. or not purely cowardice. It wasn't regret about the decision. The decision had been made, and it was the right one, and he was not reconsidering. It was something else, something that lived just below the level of thought and only surfaced in the dark. He had turned 17 in March. He was, by any measure, nearly grown, tall enough that his mother had quietly let out the hems on his robes twice in the last year, old enough that the ministry now tracked his wand use without the protection of the trace. He had passed 7 OWLs, had faced a Death Eater at 16 in the corridors of Hogwarts, had learned things in the last year that no amount of schooling could have prepared him for. None of that, he thought, particularly helped, because the thing about facing a Death Eater at 16 was that it had happened fast, in a corridor already lit with spells, with Harry and Hermione and Neville and Luna and Ginny around him. And there had been no time to think, only to act, and then to survive the acting. He had been frightened, yes. He remembered the fear clearly, the cold, mechanical quality of it, nothing like the fear in stories which was always described as rushing and hot. The fear he had felt in the Department of Mysteries had been cold and very precise, like something calculating odds. But the fear he felt now was different. This fear was patient. It had time. It sat with him through the long evenings at the Burrow, through dinner and chess games, and the ordinary maintenance of pretending that everything was ordinary. And it asked him the same question it had been asking for weeks, in various forms, all of which came down to the same essential thing. What if you're not enough? He looked at the ghoul. The ghoul made a sound in its sleep, a low, wet groan that could, he supposed, be mistaken for the symptoms of spattergroit by someone who didn't know what spattergroit actually sounded like. His mother would make it convincing. His mother could make anything convincing when she set her mind to it. What if you're not enough? He had read about the Horcruxes, what little there was to read, what little Dumbledore had shared before Dumbledore had died on a tower Ron had not been standing on. He understood what they were looking for and what it would take to destroy them. He understood, in the abstract, that the task was dangerous in ways that the word dangerous did not properly contain. He understood that Harry would go regardless. Harry would always go regardless. That was simply what Harry did, and it had stopped being remarkable to Ron years ago, in the way that it had taken him years to stop remarking on the fact that Hermione always knew the answer. These were simply facts about people he loved. But Harry going regardless meant that someone had to go with Harry, and Hermione would go because Hermione always went, because Hermione was cleverer than both of them combined and knew it and went anyway. And Ron would go because Ron was going. He was going. That was settled. But what if you're not enough? He could not, in the dark of the attic, with the ghoul breathing its laboured breath in the corner, construct a convincing argument that he was. He was not clever like Hermione. He was not extraordinary like Harry. He was, and he thought this without particular self-pity, because he had long since moved beyond the stage where this thought surprised him, Ron Weasley, who was good at chess and loyal and occasionally brave, and who had a family that loved him, and who had, by some accident of fate, become one of the two best friends of the most important person of their generation. He did not, as a rule, look too hard at that last part. The moon moved behind something, and the attic went darker. He could still see the shape of the ghoul, the pale smear of its face against the old sheet. His own face soon. His own face wearing his own illness, lying in his own bed, while he was somewhere else, entirely doing things he could not yet fully imagine. He thought about his mother. She would know, of course. She always knew. The pretending was for anyone who came to the door, for ministry, officials or Death Eaters or anyone else who thought to check. But his mother would walk past the ghoul's room every day, and she would know that it was not her son, and she would continue anyway, because that was what his mother did. She continued. She had always continued. She had sent 7 children to Hogwarts and lost people she loved and kept the house standing and the table set, and she continued. He did not know, sitting in the attic at 1:30, whether he had inherited that particular quality. He supposed he was about to find out. The fear was still there, patient, precise, asking its question. He didn't try to argue with it. He had learned this past year that fear of that sort couldn't be argued away. It could only be sat with until it became part of the furniture of a thing rather than the whole of it. He sat with it. The ghoul groaned. The house settled. Outside, somewhere in the garden, a gnome made a disgruntled sound and was quiet. Ron had been staring at the water tank for a long while, long enough that his back had begun to ache from the edge of the trunk, when he heard the footstep on the attic stair. Not a creak. Whoever it was knew, as he did, where to place their foot. He did not reach for his wand. He knew that footstep. He had known it since before he could properly walk. The door opened, and Ginny stepped through. She was in her dressing gown, her hair loose, her face carrying the particular expression she wore when she had been thinking about something for a long time and had decided, finally, to stop only thinking about it. She looked at him. He looked at her. She didn't ask what he was doing up here. He didn't explain. She crossed the attic in 6 steps. She had always been faster than him in almost everything, and sat down on the trunk beside his, not so close that it was deliberate, not so far that it was pointed, just near, the way they had always been when it mattered, just near enough. The ghoul breathed on, in its corner. Neither of them spoke. It was, Ron thought, the most honest thing that had happened to him in weeks. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. That was the thing about growing up in a house with 6 brothers, or, in Ginny's case, 6 brothers and no sisters. You learned the difference between silences early. There were silences that demanded filling, that grew hostile if left alone, that meant someone was angry or hurt, or waiting for an apology that hadn't come yet. There were silences that were simply empty, the kind that settled over a room when everyone had said what they needed to say and had nothing left. And there were silences like this one, inhabited, purposeful, the kind that 2 people arrived at together because words, just at this moment, would have been the lesser thing. Ron had learned to read Ginny's silences the way he had learned the attic stairs, by necessity, by long practice. This one said, "I know why you're here. I'm not going to make you explain it." He was grateful for that. Explaining it would have required finding words for something he had been unable to find words for in 3 weeks of trying, and the hour was late, and the attic was dark, and he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Ginny pulled her dressing gown tighter across her chest. The attic was cooler than the floors below, the heat of the day having risen and then dispersed through the gaps in the old roof, and looked at the ghoul. She looked at it for a long time, with an expression Ron recognized as the one she wore when she was deciding how much of what she was thinking to actually say. Usually, with Ginny, the answer was, most of it. Mum restuffed his pillow, she said finally. Ron looked at her. The ghouls. She nodded toward the corner. Last Tuesday, I saw her coming down from the attic with the old stuffing, and she had that look on her face. You know the one, where she's doing something practical so she doesn't have to think about what it means. She paused. She restuffed his pillow, and then she went downstairs and made enough soup for 12 people and didn't say a word about it. Ron was quiet for a moment. I didn't know that. No. You were playing chess with Harry. She said it without accusation, just information. I didn't mention it. Why not? Ginny considered this with what appeared to be genuine seriousness, because I didn't know what I'd have said after, and I didn't want to start something I couldn't finish. That, Ron thought, was possibly the most precise thing anyone had said to him in months. He recognized the instinct completely. He had been governed by it for 3 weeks. The sense that if he began to say the thing, he would have to follow it all the way to the end, and he didn't know where the end was, or what it looked like, or whether he was prepared for it when he got there. Better, then, not to begin. Except that here they were, in the attic, at the 1:30, and the not beginning had apparently run its course. How long have you been up here? Ginny asked. Hour, maybe. A bit more. I heard you on the stairs. She glanced at him sideways. You pressed too far left on the 4th step. It still creaks if you go all the way to the edge. You have to stay about 2 inches in. Ron absorbed this. You never told me that. You never needed to be that quiet before. She said it lightly, but it landed with a weight she hadn't tried to give it, and they both felt it settle into the room and stay. Ron looked back at the ghoul. Its sheet had slipped slightly, exposing one grey shoulder. The modification hadn't been done yet. That would come later, closer to the time. But even now, in the pale moonlight that had filtered back through the window, there was something about the shape of it that sat uneasily. He had not let himself look at it directly before tonight. He had come up here and looked at the trunks, the old furniture, the water, tank. The ghoul in the corner had occupied his peripheral vision and no more. Tonight, for the first time, he looked at it properly. It was not him. Of course, it was not him. It was a ghoul, a non-being of negligible intelligence, capable of groaning and breaking crockery and little else, a source of mild embarrassment to the family for as long as anyone could remember. Charlie had tried to teach it to fetch at age 7 with no success. Fred and George had spent one memorable summer attempting to train it to groan on command, which had worked twice and then never again. Percy had written a 3-page essay on attic ghouls for 3rd-year care of magical creatures and used their own ghoul as the primary source material, which the ghoul had demonstrated its opinion of by groaning through the entire interview. It had been, simply, part of the house, unlovely and permanent, like the damp patch on the kitchen ceiling and the garden that could never quite be rid of gnomes. And soon it would wear his face. Does it bother you? Ginny said. She was watching him watch the ghoul. Looking at it, I mean. Ron thought about saying no. It was the easier answer, and not entirely untrue. It didn't bother him in the way she might mean, the way that involved flinching or looking away. But it wasn't the whole answer either, and Ginny had always had an uncomfortable ability to identify the gap between what he said and what he meant. "It's strange," he said instead. "That's all. It's just strange." Strange how? He turned it over for a moment, looking for the right shape for it. That the plan is, that what keeps everyone safe is that. He nodded toward the corner. Something that isn't me, being me. And Mum walking past it every day and knowing, and Dad knowing, and everyone knowing, and carrying on anyway. "They'd do it for any of us," Ginny said. "I know. That doesn't make it easier." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." The house made a sound below them, a deep, internal groan that had nothing to do with the ghoul and everything to do with the fact that the Burrow was an old house held together by magic and stubbornness and had been expressing its structural opinions for decades. They both listened until it settled, then looked at each other, and something passed between them that was almost humor, the shared recognition of a house noise they had been hearing since birth, and then wasn't, quite, because the humor dissolved back into the thing that was actually present in the room. "You're definitely going," Ginny said. Not a question. "Yes." "I know." She looked down at her hands, which were folded in her lap with a deliberateness that told him she had placed them there intentionally. I think I've known since the end of term, actually. Maybe before. You've had that look." "What look?" "The one where you've decided something and you're not discussing it." She paused. "Harry gets it too. It's different on him. His goes sort of blank and fixed, like he's looking at something none of us can see. Yours goes tight, around the jaw." Ron lifted a hand unconsciously toward his jaw, then lowered it, which made Ginny almost smile. "I'm not criticizing," she said. I notice things. I've had 6 brothers. Noticing things was survival." "What things have you noticed lately?" Ron said, and it came out more carefully than he intended. The question shaped like an ordinary question but carrying something else underneath. The sense that he was asking because he actually wanted to know, because Ginny's noticing had always been worth more than most people's conclusions. She was quiet for a moment. The particular quality of that quiet told him she was deciding how honest to be. With Ginny, that decision usually took less than 10 seconds. "I've noticed," she said slowly, "that everyone in this house is being very careful with each other, very gentle, like we're all made of something that might crack." She looked up at him. "And I've noticed that I hate it. I hate the careful. I'd rather people just said the thing, even when the thing is bad. Especially then." Ron looked at her. She was 16, his little sister who had once sent a howler to Harry in 2nd year and signed it from their mother, who had faced a basilisk and survived it, though she would not have been able to tell you how, who had spent her 1st year at Hogwarts in a spiral she didn't remember and come out of it and kept going, kept going, kept going. Ginny had always kept going in a way that Ron privately found both admirable and faintly exhausting. But she looked, in this moment, younger than 16. Not fragile. Ginny was not fragile, had never been fragile, but stripped of the forward momentum that usually animated her face. She looked like someone who had put down a heavy thing and was standing beside it and didn't yet know whether she would pick it back up. "What's the In the garden, a scuffling, then silence. Outside, the gnome made another sound in the garden. A scuffling, then silence. "I don't want you to go," she said. "Any of you. I know it doesn't matter what I want. I know why it has to be this way, and I understand it. And I'm not going to make it harder by crying at breakfast or following Harry around making eyes at him." She stopped, drew a breath. "I'm not going to do any of that. But in here, just here, I can say it. I don't want you to go." Ron didn't say anything. He had learned from long experience that Ginny was not finished simply because she had paused. "And I'm going to go back to Hogwarts," she continued. "And I'm going to—" Another pause, shorter this time, like she was stepping over something. "I don't know what it'll be like with the Carrows there. I've heard things from people whose brothers and sisters came back at Easter and told them. I know it won't be—" She stopped again, started differently. "I know it'll be hard, and I'm not frightened of hard. I've never been frightened of hard." "I know," Ron said, "but I am—" She said the next word as though it cost her something. "I'm frightened of being on the wrong side of a door while it's happening. All of it." She looked at the ghoul again, then looked away. "That's my thing, if I was saying it." The attic held them both in silence after that. A different silence now, denser than the one they'd arrived in, full of the things they had actually said, rather than the things they'd been carefully not saying for weeks. Ron was aware that he should probably respond, that the decent thing, the brotherly thing, was to say something that helped, not fixed. He had enough sense to know that nothing he said would fix this, but something that acknowledged the weight of what she'd given him. He found, however, that he had nothing that reached the occasion. Everything that came to mind was either too small or too large. "It'll be all right" was a lie, and they both knew it. "You're braver than anyone" was true, but did not address the point. "I'll come back" was a promise he could not honestly make. And Ginny was sharp enough to know the difference between honest and dishonest promises, and he respected her too much to offer her the second kind. So he said nothing. And after a moment, Ginny seemed to understand that the silence was not absence. It was simply the best he had, and she was taking it. "Right," she said softly. Not a conclusion, just an acknowledgement that they were here, both of them, in the attic, in the dark, and that they had said the things, and that the things were now in the room between them, rather than only in their individual heads. Ron thought that was probably worth something. He wasn't sure yet how much. The ghoul shifted in its corner, pulling the sheet back over its shoulder with an unconscious gesture so mundanely human that Ron felt something move in his chest. Not sentiment exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something to do with the strangeness of everything, and the fact that the strangeness had to be lived through regardless. "You should sleep," he said eventually. "So should you." "I know." Neither of them moved. The house breathed on around them. The pipes spoke their old complaint. The moonlight came and went through the dirty window, laying its uncertain light across the trunks and the mirror, and the two Weasleys sitting side by side on the trunks in the attic, not talking anymore, but not yet ready, either, to go back downstairs to the ordinary world that was waiting for them. They sat a while longer, just near. That was enough, for now. It began as honest things sometimes do, with a question that wasn't really a question. "Are you sleeping?" Ginny asked. Ron had been staring at the water tank for the past several minutes, watching the moonlight move across its dented surface in slow increments, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once in the way that was becoming, lately, his default mode of being awake. "No," he said. "At night, I mean. Are you sleeping at night?" He considered the merits of lying. They were, on brief inspection, minimal. Ginny had been sleeping in the room next to his for 16 years. She knew what sleep looked like in this house and what it didn't. She knew the particular quality of silence that meant someone was actually unconscious versus the quality that meant someone was lying very still and hoping consciousness would eventually take the hint. "Not much," he admitted. Ginny nodded, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. She drew her knees up to her chest, wrapping the dressing gown around them, making herself compact in the way she had always been able to do. Ginny had always been good at occupying exactly as much space as she intended to and no more. It was, Ron had long thought, one of the more useful things about her. "What do you think about?" she said. "When you're not sleeping?" The water tank dripped once, somewhere in its interior, a sound like a clock marking a very small hour. "Lots of things," Ron said. "Such as?" He turned the question over. Such as the map of England that Harry had spread across the bed 2 weeks ago, pointing at forests and moorlands and coastlines with the focused intensity of someone who was planning something real, not theoretical, and the way Ron had looked at the map and felt the abstract become concrete in his stomach, a slow, cold, dropping sensation, such as Hermione's face when she described the Horcruxes, the careful, measured way she laid out information that she had clearly been organizing and reorganizing in her own mind for months, the efficiency of it and what the efficiency was covering, such as his mother in the kitchen, moving between the stove and the table with her particular determined energy, making food as though feeding people could hold back what was coming, such as the question that lived in his chest like a low-grade fever, never quite absent, never quite loud enough to demand immediate attention, always there. "Things I can't do anything about tonight," he said, which was true, if incomplete. Ginny looked at him sideways. In the dim light of the attic, he could see the expression she was wearing. Not impatient, not pressing, but open in the way that meant she would wait. Ginny could be extraordinarily patient when she chose to be. It was one of her less advertised qualities, patience, because her more visible qualities, the directness, the temper, the forward motion, tended to draw attention. But she had it. She had learned it, Ron suspected, from years of waiting for a place in a family of brothers where space was always being claimed by someone louder or larger or older. She had learned to wait, and then to move fast when the waiting was done. "You're going to sit here until I say it properly," Ron said. Not an accusation, just recognition. "I'm not in any hurry," Ginny said pleasantly. Ron stood up. He didn't have a destination. The attic was small enough that standing up was simply a change in position rather than a movement toward anything. But he needed to be vertical suddenly, needed to be occupying space differently. He walked to the window and looked out at the garden, which lay below him in the moonlight, silver grey and still. The gnome holes dark punctures in the grass, the vegetable patch a geometric shadow, the old oak at the boundary line, a presence rather than a shape. The Burrow's garden. He had pulled gnomes from it since he was old enough to swing one without losing his balance. He had sat in it on summer evenings, eating his mother's cooking and arguing with Fred and George about nothing important, and listening to his father talk about muggles with an enthusiasm that never quite diminished. He had spent measurable portions of his entire life in that garden, and he was aware, looking at it now, that he was doing the thing he had been trying not to do. The thing where you look at an ordinary thing and understand with a precision that ordinary moments don't usually carry, that you are going to miss it. He had been trying not to do that. It kept happening anyway. "I'm frightened," he said. He said it to the window, to the garden, to the gnome holes and the vegetable patch and the oak at the boundary. It was easier, he found, to say it when he was not looking at her. Behind him, Ginny said nothing. It's not. He stopped, started differently. "I know what you're going to say, that everyone's frightened, that being frightened that it's normal, it's fine. Gryffindors are frightened all the time. The whole point is that you go anyway." He paused. "I know all that. I've given myself that speech. It doesn't." He pressed his forehead briefly against the cool glass of the window, then straightened. "It doesn't actually touch the thing." "What is the thing?" Ginny said. Ron was quiet for a long moment. The garden lay still below him. The oak moved slightly at the top, a wind up there that couldn't be felt down in the attic. "I'm frightened of being the one who fails," he said. "Specifically that. Not dying, not getting hurt, not any of the things you're supposed to be frightened of. I'm frightened of being the reason it goes wrong." He heard Ginny draw a breath, but she didn't speak. "Harry can't fail," he continued, and the words came more easily now that they had started, as though the beginning had been the obstruction and the rest could follow naturally. I don't mean he's perfect or he can't make mistakes. I mean the actual failing, the final thing, the thing where Voldemort wins. That can't happen because of Harry. Harry won't let it. You know what he's like. You've known him longer than I've known you to talk, too." He glanced back over his shoulder, briefly. "He'll die before he fails. That's who he is." "I know," Ginny said quietly. "And Hermione." Ron turned back to the window. "Hermione will not fail because of stupidity or ignorance or unpreparedness. She's been preparing for this since she was 11 years old. Or she might as well have been. She's read everything. She's thought through everything. She has plans inside her plans. If something goes wrong because of a lack of knowledge or a lack of thinking, it won't be Hermione's fault." He stopped. The attic waited. "And then there's me," he said. He said it simply, without particular drama, which was somehow worse than if he had made it dramatic. The drama would have signaled performance, and performance could be dismissed. This was not performance. This was a man standing at a window in the dark saying a thing he actually believed. "And then there's me," he said again. I'm not stupid. I know. I'm not stupid. I'm not saying I'm stupid. I'm saying I'm not." He searched for the word. It took a moment. "I'm not sufficient. For this, I'm good at chess. I'm decent at Quidditch. I can hold my own in a fight. I've done that. I know I have. But this is different from all of that. And I don't know what it's going to ask of me. And I'm not." He stopped. "I don't know if what I have is what it needs." He turned around then, because he had said the core of it, and there was no reason to continue saying it to the garden. Ginny was watching him from her trunk with an expression he had not often seen on her face. Not sympathy, exactly, because Ginny's sympathy always had a crisp edge to it that kept it from becoming something softer, more like careful attention, the kind she gave things that mattered. "You've thought about this a lot," she said. 3 weeks, he said. "Every night. Every night you're not sleeping." "Yes." Ginny was quiet for a moment. She looked down at her knees, then up at him. "Can I ask you something?" she said, obviously. "When Harry asks you to do something, when you're actually in it, do you think about whether you're sufficient?" Ron frowned. "What do you mean?" "In the Department of Mysteries," she said, "when everything was happening, were you up there thinking, I hope I'm enough for this, I hope I don't fail, I hope—" "No," Ron said. "I wasn't thinking anything. I was just doing it." "Right." She looked at him steadily. "So the thinking is the problem. The thinking is what happens when there's nothing to do yet." He moved back toward the trunks and sat down, not the same trunk as before, but one slightly closer to hers, which he did not particularly intend, but noticed once he had done it. When there's something in front of you, you deal with what's in front of you. That's not the hard part. The hard part is the nights before. Like this one. Like the last 22 of them, yes. Ginny looked at the ghoul again. It had shifted slightly in its sleep, the sheet rucked up around it, its face turned toward the wall. Ron followed her gaze. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. He hadn't planned to say this. It surfaced on its own. "Third year." Ginny raised an eyebrow. "The boggart," he said. "In Lupin's class. Remember, I told you about it." "The spider." "The spider." He said it flatly. Everyone else's boggart was. Neville had Snape, and Harry had the Dementor, and Hermione's was... He stopped. "Anyway, mine was a spider. I was 13 years old, and I stood in front of a boggart, and what it gave me was a spider." He paused. "I've thought about that a lot since then. What it means. That's the thing my brain reached for when it went looking for what I was most afraid of." "You've been afraid of spiders since you were 3, Ginny said. "Bill's fault. I know whose fault it is. But there was no heat in it. The point isn't the spiders. The point is..." He rubbed the back of his neck. "The point is that when I was 13, my deepest fear was something a second year could have laughed at. And now I'm 17 and going after Horcruxes. And I'm standing there in my own head running the same calculation I've been running since I was old enough to count my brothers. Where do I fit? What do I offer? What happens if the answer is not enough?" The room was very still. Outside, far below, the oak moved again in its high, unfelt wind. "You've never said this to Harry," Ginny said. "Not an accusation, an observation." "No." "Or Hermione." "No." "Why not?" Ron thought about it honestly. "Because they need me to be all right. Or, not all right, but functional. Ready. If I told Harry this, he'd spend energy he doesn't have trying to reassure me. And he'd mean it. And it wouldn't change anything. And he'd have spent energy he doesn't have." He looked at Ginny. "You're different. Because I'm not going." The words landed between them quietly, without cruelty, but they landed. "Because you're my sister," Ron said, "and because you're not going to..." He searched for how to finish. You're not going to look at me differently after. Downstairs at breakfast tomorrow, you're not going to treat me like someone who admitted something that needs managing." He paused. Harry would try not to, but he would. Ginny was quiet for a long moment. "You're not insufficient," she said finally. "Ginny, I'm not reassuring you," she said with a firmness that cut cleanly. This isn't a speech. I'm not going to tell you you're brilliant or brave or that everything will be fine because I don't know that it will be." She met his eyes. "I'm telling you a specific thing that I know. You are not insufficient for Harry. You never have been. And I don't mean that in the way where you're useful or competent or whatever word you're using in your head to make yourself feel better. I mean he needs you, not a capable person. You." Ron looked at her. "He told me once," she said, and something shifted in her voice, something that cost her slightly to say, "that there was a period last year, I won't say when, where he was the worst he'd been, not fighting, not just inside. And he said the thing that kept him—" She stopped, edited herself. "He said knowing you were there. That was what he said." Ron did not speak for a long moment. The ghoul breathed in its corner. The moonlight held. "He never told me that," Ron said. "No," said Ginny. "He wouldn't, would he?" Ron sat with it, not the reassurance of it, because Ginny had been right that it wasn't reassurance, but the fact of it. The specific, contained, verifiable fact that Harry had said that thing to Ginny, who had no reason to invent it, and every reason, given the conversation, to offer it now. It didn't dissolve the fear. The fear was still there, patient as ever, asking its question. But the question felt, fractionally, less unanswerable than it had an hour ago. That was not nothing. In the economy of nights like this one, that was not nothing at all. "You should have said something weeks ago," he told Ginny. "You weren't ready to hear it weeks ago." He thought about arguing with that and decided she was probably right. "Right," he said. "Right," she agreed. The ghoul groaned once, deeply, and was still. Neither of them moved. The attic held them in its old darkness, and the house breathed on below, and somewhere in the garden the gnomes turned in their holes toward morning, and Ron Weasley sat in the dark with his sister and the fear that was still present and the fact that was also present, and tried to decide what to do with having said the unsayable thing. He didn't decide anything, but he was, for the first time in 22 nights, something approaching still. The attic had a way of making time feel different. Ron had noticed this before, in childhood, on the rare occasions he had come up here alone. Not to think then, but simply to be somewhere that was not the shared bedroom, not the kitchen, not the garden where Fred and George were always already doing something that required either participation or defense. The attic had always been the place in the Burrow that belonged to no one in particular, and because it belonged to no one, it had a quality of suspension, as though the ordinary movement of the household, the meals and the arguments and the noise and the constant claiming of space, could not quite reach it. It was past 2 o'clock now. He knew this not because there was a clock in the attic, but because the moonlight had shifted significantly since Ginny arrived, moving from the left side of the window to somewhere nearer the center, and he had spent enough sleepless nights calculating the moon's progress across the Burrow's various windows to be able to read it reasonably well. Past 2 o'clock, and neither of them had counterproductive in ways that tended to counterproductive in ways that tended to be felt for days afterward, and partly because he could see that she was doing the thing she had described earlier, making the decision about how much of what she was thinking to actually say. He waited. He had told her his thing, the fear of insufficiency, the weight of 3 weeks' sleepless calculation, the boggart, and what it had meant and kept meaning. He had said all of it into the dark attic to the garden outside the window, and she had not tried to resolve it, only to offer one specific fact alongside it. And somehow, that had been exactly right. He owed her the same quality of attention. So he waited, and the moonlight moved, and the ghoul breathed in its corner, and Ginny sat on her trunk with her knees drawn up, looking at the middle distance with the focused inward expression of someone assembling something. "Do you remember," she said finally, "when Dad had that whole thing with the car?" Ron blinked. Of all the ways he had imagined this beginning, it had not been this way. The flying car. Before that, when he was first building it, I was about 7, so you would have been 9. He was in the shed every evening for about 3 months, and Mum kept asking him what he was doing, and he kept saying a project, Molly, just a project, and she kept saying, Arthur, if that project is what I think it is. Ginny paused, a trace of something almost warm moving across her expression at the impression of their mother's voice. And eventually she gave up asking because you lot kept distracting her, and Dad just carried on. I remember, Ron said carefully, not sure yet where this was going. I used to go and sit in the shed with him sometimes, Ginny said, when everyone else was busy. He'd let me hand him things, screwdrivers, whatever he was using that day. All those muggle tools he kept insisting made more sense than magic for detailed work. She looked down at her hands. He used to talk while he worked. Not about the car, necessarily. Just talk. About things he found interesting. The way muggles built things without magic. Why certain engineering solutions appeared independently across both worlds. Whether the thing that made a bridge strong was the same thing that made a spell strong. She glanced at Ron. He talked to me like I was older than I was, like I could follow it. You could follow it, Ron said. You are always sharper than people gave you credit for at 7. That's not the point. She said it gently. The point is, I had that, with Dad. This thing that was just ours, just in the shed in the evenings, just the two of us. And then Fred and George found out about the car project, and suddenly they were in the shed every evening. And then Percy got interested in the Muggle mechanical theory and started bringing books. And then you started coming, and she stopped. And it was fine. It was good, actually. I liked having everyone there. But it wasn't. It was different. It became a family thing instead of our thing. And She stopped again. Ron waited. I understood why, she said. This isn't a complaint. I'm not precious about it. It's not that I thought I was special or that I deserved something no one else deserved. She uncurled her legs from under her and set her feet flat on the floor, looking at them. I just noticed the difference between being in the shed with just Dad and being in the shed with everyone, and how it felt different to be the one who got there first, the one who was there before it became something bigger. Ron had a sense of where this was going now. He kept his face still and attentive, the way she had done for him. That's what this is like, Ginny said. I'm not saying you and Harry and Hermione are a shed project. I know what this is. I'm not being... I know the difference. She looked up. But I have been, this past year, in the shed. I've been part of it, in my way. What happened in 6th year, and knowing what I know, and being... She chose the next word carefully. Present. I've been present for it in a way that I wasn't before, and it's mattered to me. And now... She stopped. Ron did not fill the silence. Now the car gets finished, she said quietly. And it goes. And I stand in the yard and watch it leave, and I go back inside. Ron looked at his sister. She was not crying. Ginny's face, when she felt things deeply, went very still rather than crumpling. She had learned, he thought, to keep feeling and expression in separate rooms, and she only opened the door between them deliberately and on her own terms. Right now, her face was still and her eyes were steady, and she was making herself hold the weight of what she had just said without looking away from it. He recognized that effort. He had been making a version of it himself for weeks. It's not, he began. Don't, she said, not unkindly. Don't tell me it's not like that. I know it's not exactly like that. I know the analogy isn't perfect. I'm not asking you to argue with my analogy. I wasn't going to argue with it, Ron said. She looked at him, slightly surprised. I was going to say it's not nothing, what you're going back to. He paused, choosing his words with more care than he usually bothered with. Hogwarts with the Carrows. Whatever that's going to be, you're not going back to nothing. I know that, Ginny said. I know it's going to be hard. I've said that. I'm not frightened of hard. I know you're not. What I said was... She stopped herself, restarted. What I said was that I'm frightened of being on the wrong side of the door. While everything is happening, that's... The door thing is the thing. Not the hardship, not the danger even, the not knowing. She said the next part carefully, as though she was finding its true shape for the first time. I'll be at Hogwarts, and things will be happening, and I won't know what they are. I won't know if you're... She stopped. I won't know. Ron understood then, with a completeness that settled into his chest like something heavy and true, exactly what she meant, because he had spent 3 weeks lying awake calculating his own potential insufficiency. But he had not once, in all that calculation, stopped to consider what it would be like to be on the other side of it, to be the one left behind with no information and no ability to act, waiting through days and weeks, and however long it took for a door to open or not open, carrying the not knowing like a stone. He had thought his position was the harder one. He was no longer entirely sure that was correct. What would help, he said, if anything would, for one. She pulled her dressing gown for one. She pulled her dressing gown tighter again. I think I've made my peace with the fact that I'm not going to feel fine about it. And that's all right. I don't need to feel fine about it. I just needed to say it somewhere. It didn't have to be managed. Like here. Ron nodded slowly. There was something clarifying, he thought, about the way Ginny approached difficulty. She did not dress it up or talk around it, or try to extract from it more meaning than it contained. She said the thing, and then she sat with the thing, and then she decided what to do with the thing, and the deciding was hers alone. She had been doing this since she was small. He could see it In retrospect now, looking back at all the small and large difficulties of her life that she had met and processed and continued past, she had, Ginny said. Go on. When we were in the 1990s, he said, I was a little girl, and 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 I was a little. Ginny said, Go on. When we were in the Department of Mysteries, he began, and everything went wrong, and people were hurt. After, when I was in the hospital wing, and I had time to think about it, I thought about you. He said it plainly, not building toward anything. Not because I was worried about you, specifically, though I was, but because you were there. You'd come, and you'd held your own, and you'd been calm in a way that I know I wasn't. And I remember thinking that Mum was going to be furious, and Dad was going to be quietly devastated, and that I was going to hear about it for years. He paused. And I also thought, she did the thing. She was there, and she did the thing, and she was fine. Ginny was watching him. You're not going to be on the wrong side of the door doing nothing, Ron said. You're incapable of doing nothing. That's not a criticism. It's just true. You'll be at Hogwarts, and it'll be hard, and you'll find a way to do the thing, because you always do. He paused. I don't know what form it'll take, but you'll find it. Ginny was quiet for a moment. That's not reassurance, she said carefully, as though testing the distinction. No, Ron agreed. It's observation. There's a difference. Something shifted in her face. Not the almost warmth from before, but something quieter and more considered. She looked at him with the expression she reserved for things that had surprised her in ways she was still processing. When did you get sensible? She said. I've always been sensible, Ron said. I've just usually been too busy being an idiot to demonstrate it. It was the first thing approaching humor either of them had said, and it landed in the room and did something small and necessary to the air, not breaking the seriousness of what they had been doing. But after a moment, "All right, Harry," she, after a moment. "All right, Harry." She said it as though the name alone was a full sentence, which in certain contexts it was. She stopped. "I'm not going to talk about Harry Inner. This isn't—" She seemed to be establishing the terms before she could continue. "I just need to say one thing about Harry. And it's not about any of the— It's not personal. It's just a fact. Ginny. He's going to spend the whole time worrying about everyone he's left behind," she said. "That's who he is. He's going to carry every single one of us with him, in his head, worrying on top of everything else he's going to be carrying." She looked at Ron directly. "When it gets hard, and it will get hard, remind him that we're all right. Not that everything's fine, because he'll know that's not true, but that we're all right. That's the difference." She held his gaze. "Can you do that?" Ron thought about Harry in the Department of Mysteries, that fixed blank expression Ginny had described, looking at something no one else could see. He thought about Harry at the funeral, still and white and unreachable in a way that had frightened Ron more than the Death Eaters had. He thought about what it would be like to carry the weight of the entire world on the specific premise that you were the only one who could set it down safely. "Yes," he said, "I can do that." "Good." She uncurled fully from the trunk, stretching her back with a slight grimace. "That's all I needed." She stood, and Ron stood, and they were both upright in the attic in the dark, and it struck him suddenly how strange and also entirely natural this had been. The two of them, here, saying the things that could not be said at breakfast, and the things sitting quietly in the room between them now, changed in nature simply by having been said. "The ghoul, eventually." "So do you." "Yes." She moved eventually. "So do you." "Yes." She moved towards the attic door, stepping over the floorboard near the water tank, with the automatic precision of long familiarity. She paused at the door with her hand on the frame and looked back at him. "Ron." "Yeah." "I meant what I said, about not being insufficient." She held his gaze for a moment, not long, but long enough for it to be deliberate. Not as comfort, as a fact. He nodded. She went back downstairs. He listened to her footsteps, 2 inches in on the 4th step, correct, quiet, sure, descending into the breathing dark of the burrow below, until he couldn't hear them anymore. He sat back down on the trunk. Their attic was his again. But it was different now, populated by the things they had said, which had a presence of their own, which would still be here in the morning when the house woke and the kettle went on, and his mother began making enough breakfast for an army, and no one said anything about what the night had held. He sat with the difference. He thought it was probably the most honest night he had spent in years. He should have gone back downstairs after Ginny left. He knew this. He had been awake for the better part of 3 hours, and his body had opinions about that which it was beginning to express with increasing clarity. A dull weight behind his eyes, a stiffness in his back from the hard edge of the trunk, the particular heaviness that settled into the shoulders when sleep had been overdue for too long. His bed was 2 floors below, still warm probably, the pillow still holding the approximate shape of where his head had been. He should have gone back down. He stayed, not because there was more to think about, Or rather, not only because of that. There was always more to think about. The thinking did not have an off switch. He had established this thoroughly over the past 3 weeks. He stayed because the attic felt, right now, like the only room in the Burrow that was entirely honest. Downstairs, everything was managed. Downstairs, his mother made soup, and his father looked carefully at the table. And Fred and George found humor in things that weren't quite funny. And everyone, collectively, maintained the surface of ordinary life with the determined energy of people who understood that the surface was the only thing keeping them all functional. He was not criticizing it. He understood why it was necessary. He was, himself, part of it. But the attic did not require maintenance, so he stayed, and after a while he stopped looking at the water tank and the trunks and the old furniture and the window, and he looked at the ghoul. He looked at it properly this time. Not the peripheral glance he had been allowing himself since he had come up here, not the careful avoidance of direct attention. He looked at it the way he had looked at hard things in chess, directly, fully, without flinching from what was actually there. It was asleep on its back now, having shifted sometime during the conversation with Ginny. The sheet was pulled up to approximately where a chest would be on a human, and one arm, grey, thin-wristed, oddly long in proportion, was resting on top of it. Its face was turned toward the ceiling, which gave him a clearer view of it than he had allowed himself before. It was not a pleasant face. Ghouls never were. The sunken eyes, the slack jaw, the skin that looked less like skin than like something that had given up on the project of skin and was attempting an approximation. It had lived in this attic for as long as anyone in the family could remember, and before that, it had presumably lived somewhere else, doing whatever ghouls did in the intervals between groaning and breaking crockery, which was apparently not much. It had no idea what it was about to be asked to do. This thought had not occurred to Ron before, and it arrived with a strange weight. The ghoul had not been consulted. The ghoul could not be consulted. That was the entire point of using a ghoul, the negligible intelligence, the absence of anything that would complicate the arrangement with awareness or objection. The ghoul would be modified, would wear his face and his illness, would lie in his bed making the sounds of spattergroit for as long as the hunt lasted, and would do all of this without comprehension. He was not, he told himself firmly, about to feel sorry for the ghoul. That was a step too far, and he was aware of it. But he kept looking at it, his face. Soon that would be his face, or close enough for someone coming to the door and being told Ron's upstairs. Very contagious. We don't like to disturb him, to be satisfied by. His mother would have done the transfiguration work carefully. She was meticulous about magic when it mattered. His mother, the warmth, and the fussing could obscure the fact that she was technically formidable. But it was there, had always been there. The precision underneath the love. His face upstairs, in his bed, while he was somewhere else. He thought about what Ginny had said in their earlier quiet, before all the rest of it. That's not really you up here, is it? Except she hadn't said it, had she? He had imagined her saying it, anticipated the observation without her having made it. He filed this away as evidence that he had been spending too much time in his own head. But the thought remained. That was not him, up here. And the question underneath the observation The one he had been circling without approaching for 3 weeks. The one that was not about the ghoul at all, but had been using the ghoul as its occasion. Who was he then, when he was somewhere else? He was Ron Weasley. He had been telling himself this in various ways for 17 years. But the content of the statement shifted depending on context. And lately, the context had been changing faster than the statement could keep up. For most of his life, being Ron Weasley had meant a specific set of things. Sixth child, youngest son, Bill's brother and Charlie's brother and Percy's brother and Fred and George's brother and Ginny's brother, Gryffindor, Harry's best friend, Hermione's. He left that one in its complicated middle distance for now. Poor by wizarding standards, or at least not wealthy, which was not the same thing, but sometimes felt like it. Decent at chess, not remarkable at school. Better than he was given credit for, in certain areas, by certain people, including himself. These things were all still true, but something had been accreting around them, in the past year especially. Something that was not any of those things, but was also not separate from them. He had made choices this past year that had been his choices, not extensions of Harry's choices or reflections of Hermione's. He had walked into Dumbledore's office in his 5th year with a stone in his chest and fury in his hands, and something that was not quite his usual self, and yet was more entirely himself than he had felt in years. He had come back this past year after. He stopped himself on that particular memory. It had its place. This was not it. The point was, something had been accreting, some sense of himself that was not defined entirely by the people alongside him, and he was about to find out how solid it was. The ghoul made a sound, not its usual groan, but something shorter, more percussive, as though it had encountered something in its sleep that required comment. It subsided. One grey hand twitched against the sheet and stilled. Ron watched it. That's not really me up here, is it? He had circled this long enough. He could look at it directly. The version of him that would stay at the Burrow. The sick boy, the acceptable excuse, the thing that kept his family safe by existing. That was not him, obviously. That had never been in question. But there was something about knowing that a version of his face would be up here, performing his absence, while he performed his presence somewhere else, that made him think about what the presence would actually consist of. He thought about Ginny's question. She had asked it clearly, without softening. Are you going because Harry needs you, or because you'd hate yourself if you didn't? He had not answered it. She had not pressed. But it had stayed in the room after she asked it, and it had stayed in the room after she left, and it was still here now, sitting in the attic air alongside everything else they had said. He turned it over. He was going because Harry needed him. This was true. He believed it without qualification. Ginny had told him what Harry had said. Knowing you were there, that was what he said. And it had landed in him as fact, not comfort, exactly as she had intended. Harry needed him, not a capable person. Him. He was also going because he would hate himself if he didn't. This was also true. He had known this since the conversation in Harry's room weeks ago, when Harry had explained the Horcrux hunt in full for the first time, laying out the enormity of it without minimizing, and Ron had felt the decision arrive in his chest, not as choice, but as recognition. Of course he was going. How could he not go? The alternative, staying here, being safe, being the boy with Spattergroit, while Harry and Hermione went alone into something that large, was not actually an alternative. Not for him, not for the specific person he had been accreting into. He was going for both reasons. He sat with the bothness of that for a moment. He had expected, he realized, that one of the reasons would be better than the other. That I'm going because Harry needs me was more honorable than I'm going because I couldn't live with not going, or vice versa. He had expected to examine them and find a hierarchy, find the purer motivation, take some comfort in that. But they were equal. They were, in fact, the same thing approached from two directions. The first from outside himself, the second from within, meeting in the middle at the same decision. He was going. He was going for good reasons, both of them. He stood up again and walked back to the window. The garden was lighter now. Not dawn, not yet, but the darkness had shifted in quality from deep to merely dark. The sky somewhere above the clouds moving through the slow, invisible work of becoming morning. He could see the gnome holes more clearly. He could see the vegetable patch and the shed and the oak at the boundary. He thought about his father in the shed, 7-year-old Ginny handing him Muggle tools and listening to him talk about bridges. He thought about what it meant that Ginny had told him that story tonight, specifically tonight. She had been, he understood now, telling him something about how she saw him, not the framing she had offered explicitly, the observation about the shed and the door and being left behind, but underneath that, the choice of that particular memory. His father in the shed, building something. Ginny, present for the beginning of it. The thing that had started small and become larger and taken on its full shape only after it was underway. He was at the beginning of something. He did not know its full shape yet. That was, he thought, probably the correct state to be at the beginning of something. The ghoul made its deep sound again, the one that filled the attic and vibrated very slightly in the old walls, and Ron turned back from the window and looked at it one final time. It looked, he decided, profoundly unbothered, as it had always looked, as it would continue to look, through everything, the modification, the performance, the weeks or months of being something it was not for purposes it could not comprehend. The ghoul did not carry the weight of what it was about to be asked to do, because the ghoul was not capable of carrying weight. It would simply do the thing that was required of it, because the thing was done to it, and then it would go back to what it had always done. Ron was not the ghoul. He had established this. He was the person who got to choose. He was choosing. The distinction felt important. In the specific way that distinctions feel important. At 3 a.m. in an attic after saying true things out loud for the first time. He was not being modified and positioned and left to perform. He was walking toward the thing with his eyes open, for reasons that were both his and someone else's, and equally valid, carrying the fear with him, because the fear was not going anywhere, and at this point, he might as well make room for it as a permanent feature of the landscape. He was going to go downstairs and get a few hours of sleep and sit at breakfast and pass the marmalade and be ordinary, because ordinary was what they all needed right now. Ordinary was the maintenance of the surface that kept everyone functional. And then, when it was time, he was going to go. He looked at the ghoul one last time. "You've got the easier job," he told it. The ghoul groaned. Ron almost smiled. in the way that Ginny had almost smiled earlier. Not quite, but the nearest available approximation. He moved toward the attic door. He remembered the floorboard, the way Ginny had described it. 2 inches in, not at the very edge. He placed his foot carefully, and the board held its silence. He paused with his hand on the door frame, in the same position Ginny had occupied when she looked back at him, and he looked back at the attic. The trunks, the old mirror, the water tank, the ghoul in its corner with its grey face turned toward the ceiling. This room, he thought. Whatever happened, he would remember this room. He went downstairs. He had not expected to sleep. He had lain down with the full expectation of continuing to be awake, of staring at the ceiling of his childhood bedroom while Harry breathed quietly in the other bed, of watching the darkness shift and the night move through its slow, uncelebrated hours toward morning. He had been awake enough nights in a row to know the shape of it by now, the particular texture of the dark at 4 in the morning versus 5, the way birds began somewhere outside well before there was any visible reason to. But he had been wrong. He closed his eyes, and the next thing he knew, the room was full of thin grey light, and Harry was still asleep, and the Burrow was beginning its morning sounds below. The creak of his mother's bedroom door, the particular footstep that meant his father was heading to the bathroom, the distant clanging that was the kettle finding its way onto the hob. He lay still for a moment, taking inventory. The fear was still there. He noted this without surprise. He had not expected the conversations in the attic to dissolve. He was not naive about the relationship between saying a thing and changing a thing. But it sat differently this morning than it had yesterday morning. It was the same fear, but he had looked at it now. He had turned it over in his hands, in the attic, at 3 in the morning, with his sister sitting on a trunk beside him, and it had not been destroyed by the examination, but it had been reduced, set in its proper proportions. It was still present, but it was not the largest thing in the room anymore. That was not nothing. He heard Harry shift in the other bed, not waking, just moving, and he lay quietly and listened to the house come alive around him and thought about what Ginny had said. Go, but don't pretend you're not scared. He turned it over carefully, the way he turned over a chess position, looking at it from multiple angles, testing its logic, checking whether it held. It was not comfort. She had been explicit about that, and she had been right. It was not the speech he might have given himself, or that someone else might have given him in the reassuring mode. The "you're braver than you think," or the "everyone is frightened," or the "Harry needs you, and that's enough." Ginny did not trade in that currency, or not often, or not with him, because she knew him well enough to know it didn't hold. What she had offered instead was specific and concrete. Go, and be honest about the fear. He had been testing this all morning, lying in the thin grey light, and he kept finding that it held in a way that reassurance wouldn't have. Because the problem with reassurance, with "you'll be fine," and "you're enough," and "don't worry," was that it required him to stop being the person he was and become a temporarily braver version of himself. It asked him to set aside the fear as the condition of moving forward. Ginny's version did not ask that. Ginny's version said, "Take it with you." He thought that was probably the most useful thing anyone had said to him in months. He thought also that Ginny was significantly wiser than he had given her credit for, and that this was likely not a new development, and he had simply not been paying adequate attention. He filed this away as something to do better. By 7 o'clock, he was downstairs. His mother was at the stove, her wand moving in its habitual patterns between the pans and the kettle and the cabinet where the plates lived, her back to the room in the way it always was this early, her attention divided in the practiced manner of someone who had made breakfast for 8 people for 20 years and could do it without looking. She registered his arrival with a slight shift of her shoulders and said, without turning, "Sit down. Eggs in 10 minutes. Morning, Mum. You look tired." She glanced back at him then, briefly, and her eyes did the thing they always did. The rapid inventory, checking for damage, cataloguing whatever she found, and storing it for private consideration. She had always done this with all of them. Ron had stopped noticing it years ago, except in moments like this one when he was looking for it. "Didn't sleep well," he said. "No." She turned back to the stove. Something in her back, in the set of her shoulders, acknowledged this without making it a conversation. She knew about bad nights. She was, he suspected, something of an authority. "Tea's ready." He poured himself tea and sat at the table and looked at the kitchen, the scrubbed wooden table, the mismatched chairs, the clock on the wall with its 9 hands and its 9 names, each pointing to something different. His own hand was pointing to home, which was where it always pointed when he was in the Burrow, and which would point to mortal peril when he was not. He did not look at the clock for long. Ginny came down at 7:30, still in her dressing gown, her hair not yet sorted, with the expression of someone who had slept adequately and was prepared to be civil but not enthusiastic about the morning. She sat down across from Ron, accepted tea from the pot he nudged in her direction, and looked at him over the rim of her mug with eyes that were perfectly ordinary. Not "how are you after last night?" Not "did you sleep?" Not the complicated acknowledgement of shared confidences that might, in another household, have required some kind of morning after processing. Just eyes over a mug, ordinary, the same as any other morning. He understood. He met her eyes briefly, nodded, almost imperceptibly, and looked at his tea. That was sufficient. That was the whole of it, in the daylight, in the kitchen, with the eggs almost ready, and his mother at the stove. The attic had its contents, and this room had its contents, and they did not need to be the same contents. He passed her the marmalade without being asked. She took it without comment. His mother set plates in front of them, and Ron ate, and the Burrow went about the ordinary business of becoming morning. Harry came down at 8, looking approximately as rested as Ron felt, which was to say not very but functional. He sat down, accepted the plate Ron's mother immediately produced with the efficiency of someone who had been monitoring the stairs, and started eating with the focused attention of someone who had a lot on their mind and was taking the opportunity of breakfast to not think about it. Ron watched him across the table. He thought about what Ginny had said. He's going to spend the whole time worrying about everyone he left behind. He thought about what she had asked him to do. Remind him that we're all right. Not that everything's fine, that we're all right. He turned this over now, looking at Harry, who was eating toast with the slightly distant expression that meant his thoughts were elsewhere. The distinction Ginny had drawn. All right, versus everything's fine was one that only someone who knew Harry very well would understand to make. Because Harry had a sharp and practiced sensor for dishonesty, particularly optimistic dishonesty, particularly the kind that asked him to believe everything was fine when it clearly was not. He had been told everything was fine too many times by too many people who meant well in circumstances that were demonstrably not fine, and he had learned to hear the gap between the statement and the reality. We're all right was different. It was containable. It made no claims about circumstances, only about people, their capacity to hold what they were holding, their continued existence, their basic functional okayness in the face of things that were not fine. Ron thought he could honestly say that of his family. He thought he could say it of himself even. He was all right. He was frightened and he had not slept enough, and he was going to do something very large and very dangerous, and he did not know how it would end. But he was all right. He was, in the specific sense Ginny had meant, still standing. He would remember to say so when it was needed. Fred and George came down at 9, loud and immediate in the way they always were, filling the kitchen with a kind of noise that was not quite conversation and not quite performance, but somewhere between the two. They had apparated in from the flat above the shop. They had been doing this most of the summer, appearing for meals with the energy of people who lived close enough to visit often, but separately enough to have things to report. Ron watched them too, this morning, with the different attention that the night had given him. He saw because he was looking for it. The moment Fred's eye caught his mother's across the room, and something passed between them that was managed and contained, and Fred looked away and made a joke about something, and his mother laughed, and the management of it was so practiced that if you were not watching for it, you would see only the surface. He saw George, refilling his tea, pause for just a fraction of a second with his back to "We're all right too." They were carrying "We're all right too." They were carrying things, his family, each of them carrying their specific version of the weight, in their specific ways. His mother in the soup and the restuffed pillow, his father in the careful stillness at the table, Fred and George in the noise that was also coverage, Ginny in the attic at 2 a.m. saying the thing that couldn't be said at breakfast. He had not, until last night, understood the full picture of it. He had been so occupied with his own fear, his own calculation, that he had been looking inward when he might have been looking outward. And what he found now, looking outward, was a family that was doing exactly what his family had always done, carrying on with full knowledge of what carrying on cost, because the alternative was not actually an alternative. He loved them so much, it was briefly difficult to finish his eggs. He finished them anyway. The morning moved forward. His mother found tasks for everyone, as she always did, the tasks being her method of maintaining the surface. Gnomes needed dealing with, and the garden needed attention, and there was something wrong with one of the kitchen chairs that his father could probably fix if he stopped reading the prophet long enough to look at it. Fred and George were dispatched on an errand to the village. Harry, who could never sit entirely still, offered to help Gnome and was accepted with an efficiency that suggested his mother had been expecting this. Ron found himself in the garden mid-morning, standing at the boundary near the oak, watching Harry swing a gnome in the long arc that sent it over the hedge with enough speed to discourage immediate return. Harry had always been good at denoming. He had the arm for it, the same arm that could put a snitch anywhere he wanted it. He sent 3 gnomes over the hedge in quick succession, checked the sky with the habitual upward glance of someone who had spent years scanning it, and looked at Ron. "Sleep all right?" Harry asked. "Not really," Ron said. "You?" "Not particularly." This was, Ron thought, the complete version of that conversation as Harry understood it. The acknowledgement, the mutual confirmation, the closing of the topic because there was nothing useful to add. He would once have left it there. He had left it there many times over many years. "This morning," he said, "I've been thinking." Harry looked at him, the gnome-free hand dropping to his side. "Not about the plan," Ron said. The plan is fine. I'm not." He stopped, organized himself. "I'm not reconsidering. I just want to say one thing." Harry waited. He was good at waiting when it mattered, Harry. He had learned it, Ron thought, from years of having to listen to things he didn't want to hear, from Dumbledore, and before Dumbledore, from people who were less careful with the listening they required. "I'm frightened," Ron said. "Of this. I want you to know that. Not so you do anything about it." He cut Harry off before Harry could speak. "Not so you reassure me, just so you know. So it's honest. Between us." Harry looked at him for a long moment. "Me too," Harry said. They looked at each other. "Right," Ron said. "Right," Harry agreed. It was, Ron thought, the most they had said to each other about it. It was not a large exchange. It did not cover everything or resolve anything or prepare either of them for what was coming. But it was honest. And Ginny had been right, he thought. The honest thing and the brave thing were not always the same thing, but sometimes, in the right moment, they were both small enough to actually do. A gnome surfaced near the oak, made a disgruntled sound, and looked at both of them with the affronted expression gnomes wore when morning arrived without announcing itself. The last ordinary morning arrived without announcing itself. That was the thing about last ordinary mornings. They did not come labeled. They arrived in the same way all mornings arrived, with the same sounds and the same light and the same smell of toast from the kitchen below. And it was only afterward, in retrospect, that you could point to one and say, that was the one. That was the morning before everything changed. While you were inside it, it felt like any other. Ron had been awake since 6. Not the wakeful anxiety of the previous weeks, the cold, precise fear, the calculations running on their private loop. This was simpler. He was awake because he had slept enough, and because the light through the gap in the curtain had found his eyes at the right angle, and because he lay there and listened to the Burrow doing its morning things and thought, this is the one. He didn't know for certain. Nothing had been announced. No date had been formally declared. But there had been a conversation the evening before between his father and Harry, quiet and brief, with a quality of finality to it. And his mother had made a very large dinner with no occasion to justify it, and Fred and George had stayed late, later than they usually stayed, in the way that people stay when they understand, without being told, that this is the staying that counts. He lay in the early light and listened to Harry sleep and thought, this is the one. He dressed quietly and went downstairs before anyone else. The kitchen was empty, the table still bare, the kettle cold on the hob. He stood in the center of it for a moment and simply looked at the mismatched chairs and the scrubbed table and the shelf where his mother kept the things that didn't belong anywhere else, accumulated artifacts of family life. A small ceramic owl that had been there since before he was born, a collection of Spello tape rolls in varying states of depletion, 3 of George's extendable ears that had been confiscated at some point and apparently never reclaimed, a photograph of all 9 of them taken in Egypt that he had walked past 10,000 times without looking at properly. He looked at it now. They were all squinting in the sun. He remembered that, the relentless Egyptian sun, all of them complaining about it within 20 minutes of arriving. Bill was tallest on the left, already with the long hair that would later be accompanied by the earring. Charlie was next to him, already broad, already with that quality of physical ease that came from working with dragons. Percy in the middle, upright, his Hogwarts prefect badge on even on holiday, because Percy had always had a complex relationship with the distinction between on-duty and off-duty. Fred and George on either side of him, mirror image grins, the specific expression they wore when they had just done something or were about to. His mother, small and central, and somehow managing to look as though she was holding the whole photograph together by sheer force of presence. His father beside her, delighted with everything as he always was abroad, the novelty of a foreign country, and the muggles in it never failing to produce in him an almost childlike enthusiasm. Ginny, second from the right, 8 years old, squinting ferociously at the sun with both hands shading her eyes, chin lifted. Himself, on the end, 11 years old, about to begin his first year at Hogwarts. He had been frightened that summer, not of Hogwarts itself. He had been looking forward to Hogwarts with the uncomplicated anticipation of someone who had been hearing about it all his life. Frightened of something he hadn't had words for yet, something about being the 6th, about the long row of brothers ahead of him, about the specific challenge of being new to a place where your name was already known. He looked at the 11-year-old in the photograph. He thought, "You have no idea what's coming." He thought, also, "You'll be all right." His mother came down at 6:30, found him at the table with tea he had made himself, and stopped in the doorway for just a moment, a pause so brief that he might have missed it if he had not been looking for it, if he had not been paying the different attention the night in the attic had given him. She crossed to the stove without comment and began the familiar sequence, wand moving, pans settling into their positions, the morning machinery of feeding her family engaging with the reliability of something very deeply habitual. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't stay in bed." She was quiet for a moment. The kettle began to heat. "Hungry?" she asked. "Not yet. I will be." She nodded as though this was useful information and continued her preparations. He watched her, and she did not look back at him, and the kitchen filled slowly with heat and the smell of things cooking, and neither of them said anything that needed to be said, because it had already been said in the ways that his family said things, through soup and restuffed pillows and very large dinners with no occasion to justify them, through the particular quality of ordinary mornings that were not quite ordinary, through the silent, precise language of people who had been loving each other for a long time and knew which rooms required words and which did not. He got up and set the table. She did not thank him for it. He did not require thanks. They came down in their various ways. His father first, newspaper under his arm. pausing to squeeze Ron's shoulder once as he passed. A brief pressure, no comment attached. Gone before Ron could respond to it. Harry next, who sat down and accepted tea and looked at the table with the fixed expression that meant he was somewhere else, and then looked up and met Ron's eyes, and the look between them held the conversation from the garden. "I'm frightened, me too, right? Right." And then moved on. Ginny came down at 7, hair still loose, unhurried, and sat across from Ron in the same chair she had occupied yesterday and the day before and every morning of her life at this table. She reached for the marmalade before he could pass it. He noticed this and moved it slightly in her direction anyway. A fractional adjustment, and she took it without looking at him. Small, entirely ordinary. The whole of last night, compressed into the passing of marmalade. Fred and George arrived at 7:30, apparating in with the crack that still made his mother flinch even after years of it, both of them carrying the slightly deliberate energy of people who had decided how they were going to be this morning and were implementing the decision. George sat next to Ginny. Fred sat at the end and immediately began an elaborate complaint about the gnomes, which he claimed had developed tactical sophistication overnight and were now operating in coordinated units. "You're making that up," Ron said. "I saw it with my own eyes. 2 of them were using hand signals. Gnomes don't have hands. They have... That's what they want you to think." His mother set plates in front of all of them with the practiced speed of long experience, and Ron ate, and the table was loud with the ordinary noise of his family being his family. Fred's invention, George's embellishment, his father asking a question about gnome intelligence that was entirely genuine, his mother saying Arthur in the tone that meant stop encouraging them, Harry smiling at his eggs in the way he did when he found himself inside something warm that he hadn't expected. Ron looked at all of it. He did not, he found, try to memorize it. He had spent weeks half memorizing things, looking at the garden, at the clock, at the photograph from Egypt, with the desperate, squinting attention of someone trying to fix things in place before they moved. This morning, he just looked. He let it be what it was, without the effort of preservation. It would stay or it would fade in the way that things stayed or faded, and the having of it, here, now, was not diminished by its future uncertainty. That was something the attic had given him, he thought, the ability to let the thing be the thing, without needing it to also be a monument to itself. After breakfast, the morning arranged itself. His father and Harry went to the sitting room, the final quiet conversation Ron had been expecting. Practical details, last considerations, the business of departure given its necessary shape. Fred and George stayed at the table, and the noise level dropped from its breakfast register to something more genuinely quiet, and at one point, Fred said something to George in a voice too low to hear, and George nodded, and that was the whole of that, and it was sufficient. Ron washed up. He did this deliberately, not because it needed doing, urgently, but because it was a thing to do with his hands, and because his mother had been doing everything for everyone all summer, and he could do this one small thing, and because there was something grounding about the cold water and the ordinary weight of plates that he found useful this morning. His mother stood beside him and dried. They did not speak. The window above the sink looked out onto the garden, and Ron watched the gnomes conducting their operations in the vegetable patch tactical sophistication entirely absent as far as he could tell, despite Fred's report, and his mother dried the plates with her wand and set them on the shelf, and the morning moved through its last ordinary minutes. Ginny found him in the garden afterward. He was standing near the oak again, not doing anything in particular, just standing. She came and stood beside him, shoulder almost at his shoulder, looking at the same middle distance. "Today," she said, not a question. "Probably," he said. She nodded. They stood in the garden, and the summer air moved around them, carrying the smell of grass and the faint woody scent of the oak and the distant smell of his mother's cooking, still present, even though breakfast was over, embedded in the Burrow's air like everything else that had ever happened here. "I meant what I said," Ron told her. "Last night." "Which part?" "The part about you'll find the thing at Hogwarts, whatever form it takes." He looked at her. "You will." Ginny was quiet for a moment. She looked at the oak, at the boundary of the garden, at the line where the Burrow's land met whatever was beyond it. "I know," she said. And then, after a pause so brief, he almost missed it. "So will you." He went back inside. He climbed the stairs, pressed 2 inches in on the 4th attic step from long habit, though he was not going to the attic, and went to his room and sat on his bed and looked at Harry's empty half, the rumpled covers, the few things Harry had kept out rather than already packed. He looked at his own room. He had not done this either, in the memorizing way. He just looked at it. The low ceiling, the orange walls that he had never exactly chosen but that had become, over 17 years, simply the color of home. The Chudley Cannons poster that had been there since he was 8 and had never come down, despite the Cannons' sustained commitment to underperformance. The window that looked out toward the garden. He thought, "This is a good room." He thought, "I'll be glad to come back to it." Not a promise, just a preference, expressed in the quiet of his own head, with no one to hear it, and no obligation for it to be anything more than what it was. He stood up, checked his bag, packed for the 3rd time, everything in its place, and went back downstairs. They left in the late afternoon. His mother held him for a long time, not saying anything, which was the version of his mother he trusted most. The wordless one, the one that didn't try to cover the weight of things with the sounds of things. He held her back and let it be as long as it needed to be, and did not rush it. His father's hand on his shoulder again, the same brief pressure as morning, and this time his father looked at him directly, and Ron looked back, and his father said, very quietly, "Proud of you, Ron." Just that. Ron nodded. He could not, at this moment, produce words, and his father understood this, because his father had always understood the things that didn't have words. Fred and George stood at the edge of the yard, arms crossed in identical postures, wearing identical expressions that were not quite their public expressions. Something underneath the performance, briefly visible before they closed it again, and Fred said, "Don't do anything we wouldn't do," which covered almost nothing. And George said, "Stay alive, preferably," which covered everything. And then Ginny. She didn't say anything. She walked up to him in the yard and looked at him for a moment, and then stepped forward and hugged him, briefly and hard, in the way she rarely did. Ginny was not a casual hugger. She gave them deliberately and infrequently, and it meant something when she did, and then stepped back. She looked at him. He looked at her, Go, she had said, in the attic. But don't pretend you're not scared. He was scared. He was going. Both things, together, walking in the same direction. He picked up his bag. He went. Behind him, the Burrow stood in the late afternoon light. The leaning chimneys, the impossible upper floors, the garden with its gnomes, the oak at the boundary, the window of the attic just visible above the roofline, small and dark and holding its silence. His mother stood in the yard and watched until she couldn't see them any more. She went back inside. She put the kettle on. She continued. The ghoul did not know what it had witnessed. This was, of course, the point. The ghoul had slept through all of it, through Ron's 3 hours of solitary sitting, through Ginny's footstep on the stair, through everything that had been said and left unsaid and said again differently, through the long, honest dark that had settled over 2 siblings and refused to lift until it had taken what it came for. The ghoul had groaned its periodic groan and shifted its sheet and offered nothing except its accidental presence. And in the morning, it was exactly what it had always been, unbothered, unchanged, indifferent to the weight of what the room had held. Some witnesses are like that. The attic itself was another matter. Old rooms keep things. Not in any magical sense, not the lingering enchantments of spellwork or the residue of dark magic that some places carry in their stones, but in the simpler way that rooms keep the shapes of what has happened in them. The particular quality of a space after something true has been said in it is different from the quality before. The air settles differently. The dark has a different texture. Anyone who has ever sat in a room where something honest and difficult was given its full weight will recognize this. The way the room feels inhabited even after everyone has left it. The Burrow's attic felt that way in the days that followed. Ginny noticed it. She went up twice in the following week, once for a reason, retrieving something from one of the trunks, and once for no reason at all, simply standing in the doorway in the early morning and looking at the room before going back downstairs. The ghoul was there, as it always was. The trunks were there. The window with its dirty glass admitted the same pale light. Nothing had changed in any way that could be pointed to or described, but it felt different. She thought it would feel different for a long time. The conversations they'd had that night did not solve anything. This is worth saying plainly, because stories have a tendency to imply that the honest conversation, the true thing said in the dark, resolves what it addresses, that the fear once named diminishes, that the grief once spoken lightens, that 2 people who tell each other the truth in the middle of the night will walk into the morning changed in ways that hold. Sometimes that is true. More often, the honest conversation simply means that you carry the weight with company rather than alone. The weight is still there. The fear is still present. The grief still present. The not knowing still present. But you have been witnessed in it, and the witnessing changes nothing about the circumstances and everything about the bearing of them. Ron carried his fear with him. He had said he would, and he did. Ginny carried her not knowing. She had known she would have to, and she did. Neither of them carried it alone anymore. That was what the attic gave them. Not answers. There were no good answers. There had never been good answers. The night had established this clearly, and neither of them had pretended otherwise. Not comfort, not resolution, not the reassurance that everything would be fine. just the specific, durable, quietly powerful thing that happens when two people sit in the dark and tell each other the truth, and neither of them looks away. They had looked at the hard thing. They had let it be hard. And then they had gone back downstairs and set the table and passed the marmalade and been ordinary, because ordinary was what was needed. And they were both, in their different ways, equal to the task of being ordinary when it mattered. This is the Weasley inheritance, perhaps. Not the poverty that became a joke they never quite found funny. Not the hand-me-down robes, or the two small bedrooms, or the ancient creaking house that defied both gravity and architectural logic by remaining upright. Not even the fierce particular love that filled every room of it. This, the capacity to sit with the weight of things and continue, to know what was coming and make the soup anyway, to restuff the pillow and not speak of it, to stand in the yard and watch until you couldn't see them anymore, and then go back inside and put the kettle on. The Burrow stood. It had always stood. It would stand a while longer yet.